When people hear that my husband inherited $10 million, they usually assume the craziest thing that happened afterward involved luxury spaceships, private moons, or distant alien vacations. They are wrong. The craziest thing that happened afterward was my mother-in-law. My husband and I had been married for 3 years. He came from one of the most respected alien families on our colony world, while I was a completely ordinary human woman who worked as a botanical technician. Despite our different backgrounds, our relationship had always been simple. We laughed together, supported each other, and genuinely enjoyed spending time with one another. Money had never been the reason we were together. In fact, when we first met, he was renting a tiny apartment above a noodle restaurant because he wanted to live independently from his wealthy family. The first date he took me on involved street food and a broken public transport pod that stranded us for 2 hours. I fell in love with him long before I ever knew he came from money. 6 months after his grandfather passed away, he unexpectedly inherited $10 million. It was a life-changing amount of money, but surprisingly little changed between us. We still argued over what shows to watch at night. We still spent weekends exploring local markets. We still ordered too much food whenever either of us claimed we weren't hungry. Then came the news that made us even happier than the inheritance. I was pregnant. The moment the doctor confirmed it, my husband nearly cried. He hugged me so tightly that the doctor had to remind him that pregnant women still needed oxygen. For weeks, we kept the news private while we prepared to tell our families. When the day finally arrived, we organized a family dinner. Everyone seemed excited. At first, my husband stood and proudly announced that we were expecting a baby. The room erupted with cheers and congratulations. Everyone looked thrilled. Everyone except his mother. She didn't smile. She didn't clap. She narrowed her eyes at me as if I had just confessed to robbing a bank. The room slowly grew quiet. Then she reached into her handbag. I expected tissues. Maybe a gift. Instead, she pulled out several sheets of paper. Actual printed documents. My husband blinked. "Mom, why do you have paperwork?" She dramatically spread the papers across the dining table. "I knew this would happen." The entire room froze. "What would happen?" my husband asked. She pointed directly at me. "This." I looked around, genuinely confused. "This what?" "The pregnancy." Several relatives exchanged nervous glances. My mother-in-law cleared her throat and tapped one of her papers. "My son inherits $10 million. Tap. 6 months later. Tap. Suddenly there's a pregnancy. Tap. The timeline is suspicious." I nearly choked on my drink. The timeline? She had created a timeline. For my pregnancy. My husband stared at the documents. "Mom, are those charts? I spent 3 weeks preparing them." One cousin immediately pulled out his phone to start recording. Another relative quietly whispered, "This is going to be amazing." My mother-in-law stood up like a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. "I believe this pregnancy is fake." The room exploded with shocked gasps. My husband looked horrified. I looked confused. And one uncle looked genuinely impressed by her presentation skills. My mother-in-law continued, "She's obviously trying to secure access to the family fortune." My husband stood up so quickly his chair nearly tipped over. "Mom, that's ridiculous." "No, what's ridiculous is expecting me to believe this coincidence." I wanted to argue. I wanted to defend myself. Instead, I noticed how absolutely serious she looked. She truly believed her own conspiracy. That somehow made the situation even funnier. The dinner collapsed into chaos. Relatives argued. My husband defended me repeatedly. His mother refused to back down. Finally, she gathered her papers and marched toward the door. Before leaving, she turned dramatically. "I will expose the truth." Then she left. The front door slammed. Silence filled the room. A cousin slowly raised his hand. "Just to clarify, she's declaring war on a pregnant woman?" Nobody answered. Because somehow, that was exactly what had happened. At the time, I thought the whole thing was ridiculous. What I didn't know was that my mother-in-law was about to spend the next 6 months turning herself into the most expensive amateur detective in neighborhood history. I assumed my mother-in-law's dramatic exit from the family dinner would be the end of it. I was very, very wrong. 3 days later, my husband received a message from a private investigation company asking if he would like to comment regarding an active inquiry involving his family. That was the moment we realized his mother wasn't joking. She had actually hired investigators. Professional investigators. To investigate a pregnant woman. My husband stared at the message for nearly a full minute before looking at me. Please tell me this is some kind of prank. I shook my head. No investigator would make up something this embarrassing. Unfortunately, things only became stranger from there. The investigators followed me everywhere. To prenatal appointments. To grocery stores. To baby supply shops. To restaurants. One afternoon I waved at one of them through a bakery window because he had been sitting in the same parked vehicle for 3 hours. The poor guy looked embarrassed. A week later, one of the investigators accidentally approached me while leaving a medical clinic. I'm sorry about all this, he said quietly. How bad is it? He sighed. Your mother-in-law calls us every day. Every day? Sometimes twice. Apparently, she demanded constant updates. Unfortunately for her, every update said exactly the same thing. Pregnant woman attends doctor appointment. Pregnant woman buys baby clothes. Pregnant woman eats strange food combinations. Pregnant woman returns home. Normal pregnancy activities. My husband laughed every time he heard a new report. One evening he wrapped an arm around me while reading another investigator summary. This might be the most expensive confirmation of a pregnancy in history. I laughed. I should send your mother my medical records and save her some money. Instead, she doubled her efforts. Soon investigators weren't enough. She recruited neighbors. Actual neighbors. One elderly man began walking his dog past our house so often that even the dog seemed confused. The poor animal eventually refused to continue. A woman across the street suddenly developed an intense interest in our trash bins. Another neighbor volunteered to monitor grocery deliveries. At one point, my husband looked out the window and counted 3 different people pretending not to watch our house. They're all terrible at spying. They really are. One neighbor hid behind a decorative tree that was thinner than his own body. Another spent so much time staring toward our house that he walked directly into a mailbox. The situation became even more ridiculous when my mother-in-law created what she called her evidence center. A cousin secretly showed us pictures. An entire room in her house had been converted into a conspiracy headquarters. Strings connected photographs. Charts covered the walls. Printed schedules were pinned everywhere. There were maps. Timelines. Financial records. Medical appointment dates. According to one relative, she looked like someone trying to solve an interstellar criminal conspiracy. The only problem was that her suspect was a happily pregnant woman whose greatest crime was craving ice cream at 2 in the morning. Months passed. My pregnancy progressed normally. Every doctor appointment confirmed that both the baby and I were healthy. Meanwhile, my husband became more supportive than ever. The insanity somehow brought us closer together. Every evening we sat together assembling nursery furniture and laughing about whatever absurd theory his mother had invented that week. When I worried about the stress, he always squeezed my hand. You know what's funny? What? Mom has spent more money investigating this baby than she's spent buying gifts for any baby in the family. I nearly fell off the couch laughing. The funniest part was that every investigation produced the same conclusion. I was pregnant. Very obviously pregnant. Yet my mother-in-law refused to accept reality. Every report that confirmed the truth only convinced her there was an even bigger conspiracy. By the 4th month of her investigation, she had already spent a small fortune. By the 5th month, some investigators were quietly requesting reassignment. And by the 6th month, she had spent enough money to buy a luxury spacecraft. Despite all of it, she still had absolutely nothing. No evidence. No proof. No scandal. Nothing except stacks of reports proving that I was exactly what I claimed to be. A pregnant woman preparing for motherhood. Most people would have accepted defeat. My mother-in-law wasn't most people. Instead of stopping, she decided it was finally time to expose me publicly. By the 6th month, my mother-in-law's investigation had become local entertainment. People weren't talking about my pregnancy anymore. They were talking about her. The woman who had spent a fortune trying to prove a pregnant woman wasn't pregnant. Even the neighbors who originally helped her had started treating the whole thing like a comedy series. Every week there seemed to be a new episode. One investigator quit after 3 months. Another reportedly told her that unless I suddenly gave birth to a toaster, there wasn't much left to investigate. That comment became famous throughout the neighborhood. My husband nearly laughed himself sick when he heard it. Meanwhile, our lives remained wonderfully normal. We decorated the nursery. We attended parenting classes. We spent evenings discussing baby names. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at the tiny crib we'd assembled together. The look on his face always made me smile. For all the chaos his mother created, he never allowed it to distract him from what mattered. He was excited to become a father. And I was excited to start our little family. Unfortunately, his mother had reached a different conclusion. She believed the problem wasn't her investigation. The problem, according to her, was that nobody had seen her evidence. So she organized what she called a community truth presentation. Those exact words. Invitations were actually sent out. Neighbors received messages. Relatives were contacted. Friends were encouraged to attend. Apparently, she intended to reveal the shocking truth once and for all. The event was held at a local community hall. When my husband and I arrived, I almost burst out laughing. The room was packed. Not because people believed her. Because people wanted to see what happened next. Some guests had brought snacks. One man was carrying popcorn. Actual popcorn. My husband leaned toward me. "I think we've accidentally become reality television," I noticed. At the front of the room stood a giant projection screen. Beside it was my mother-in-law. She looked incredibly confident. Far more confident than someone should after spending 6 months being wrong. The presentation began. She cleared her throat dramatically. "Ladies and gentlemen, today I will expose the truth." The lights dimmed. A slideshow appeared. The first slide displayed a timeline. The second displayed photographs. The third displayed medical appointment records. The fourth displayed grocery receipts. The fifth displayed investigator reports. As the presentation continued, something remarkable happened. Every piece of evidence proved I was pregnant. Not fake pregnant. Pregnant. 100% undeniably pregnant. The audience began exchanging confused looks. My mother-in-law kept talking. Unfortunately, the slides refused to support her argument. "This receipt clearly shows suspicious activity." The receipt showed I had purchased prenatal vitamins. "This photo raises serious questions." The photo showed me leaving a maternity clinic. "This report is highly concerning." The report literally stated that I was attending pregnancy checkups. A few people started laughing. Then more people started laughing. Then almost everybody started laughing. My mother-in-law didn't notice. She continued speaking with complete confidence. Finally, a familiar voice came from the audience. One of the former private investigators had attended. He slowly stood up. "I worked this case for 4 months." The room immediately became quiet. My mother-in-law smiled. Clearly, she expected support. Instead, the investigator sighed. "She's pregnant." The room exploded. Laughter bounced off every wall. Several people nearly fell from their chairs. One woman laughed so hard she couldn't breathe properly. The investigator continued. "We had medical confirmations." More laughter. "We had witness statements." Even more laughter. "We had surveillance." People were openly crying from amusement. And after spending months investigating, the only mystery was why we were still investigating. That was the final blow. The audience completely lost control. Even my husband couldn't stop laughing. I tried to remain polite. I really did. But when I saw a man wiping tears from his eyes while clutching a bag of popcorn, my self-control disappeared. My mother-in-law stood frozen beside her presentation. For the first time in 6 months, she seemed to realize that things weren't going according to plan. The evidence board. The investigators. The reports. The surveillance. The money. All of it had led to this moment. And this moment had turned her into the biggest joke in town. My husband gently squeezed my hand. "It's over." I thought so too. But life had one final surprise waiting. Because less than an hour after the most expensive failed accusation in neighborhood history, I felt a sudden sharp contraction. Then another. I looked at my husband. His eyes widened. The laughter around us faded into the background. And for the first time that entire evening, something truly important was happening. Our baby was on the way. The drive to the hospital was considerably less dramatic than my mother-in-law's presentation, but infinitely more important. My husband barely remembered how to operate the vehicle. The man who had calmly managed multimillion-dollar business negotiations suddenly forgot where the ignition button was. Twice. I was in labor and somehow still found the energy to laugh at him. "Sweetheart," I said between contractions, "you inherited $10 million, but apparently not the ability to drive under pressure. I am focused. You just turned on the windshield cleaners. It was an accident." Despite the chaos, he never let go of my hand. Hours later, after what felt like the longest day of our lives, our baby finally arrived. The moment our child was placed in his arms, everything changed. My husband stared down at the tiny face with tears in his eyes. For several seconds he couldn't even speak. Then he smiled. It was the happiest smile I had ever seen. And immediately everyone noticed something else. The baby looked exactly like his father's side of the family. The same eyes. The same facial features. The same little expressions. One nurse jokingly commented that there should never have been any debate regarding the baby's family connections. News spread quickly. Relatives visited. Friends stopped by. Photos circulated. Every single picture made my mother-in-law's failed investigation look even more ridiculous. If she had hoped for some final miracle proving she had been right, that hope vanished immediately. The baby was undeniable. The neighborhood, however, was not ready to let the story die. Not even close. Within weeks, people had given her investigation a nickname. Operation Fake Baby. The name stuck. At family gatherings, someone inevitably mentioned it. At community events, people joked about it. One neighbor even created a mock award certificate recognizing her outstanding commitment to incorrect conclusions. My husband framed it. I wish I were kidding. The greatest moment came during our first large family reunion after the birth. A cousin arrived carrying a gift bag. Inside was a toy detective kit intended for the baby. The entire room burst into laughter. The attached card read, "Just in case Grandma needs help with future investigations." Even I couldn't stop laughing. Then another relative presented a custom coffee mug. Printed across the front were the words, "Chief Pregnancy Investigator." My husband laughed so hard he nearly dropped the mug. Meanwhile, details about the investigation expenses finally became public. When relatives learned how much money had been spent, the room fell silent. Then came the collective shock. More than $200,000. Investigators. Equipment. Surveillance. Reports. Consultations. Months of obsession. All spent proving absolutely nothing. One uncle stared at the number for nearly a full minute. "You know," he finally said, "she could have just bought baby gifts." That comment became almost as famous as the investigation itself. Through all of it, I never tried to embarrass her. I never demanded revenge. I never reminded her how wrong she had been. Honestly, I didn't need to. Reality handled that better than I ever could. A few months later, she finally asked to speak with me privately. For the first time since this entire disaster began, She looked genuinely uncomfortable. She apologized. Not dramatically. Not publicly. Just sincerely. She admitted that fear and suspicion had convinced her to believe the worst. She said she had nearly destroyed relationships that mattered. Most importantly, she admitted that she had been completely wrong about me. I accepted the apology. Not because she deserved forgiveness. Not because I had forgotten everything. But because our child deserved a family that could move forward. When my husband learned about the conversation, he wrapped his arms around me and smiled. "You're a better person than most people would be." I shrugged. Maybe. The truth was simpler. Love had already won. Our little family was happy. Our son was healthy. And the people who truly mattered had stood beside us from the beginning. A year later, the story was still legendary throughout the neighborhood. New residents heard it. Old residents retold it. Nobody could quite believe that someone had spent over $200,000 trying to prove a perfectly normal pregnancy was fake. Yet somehow it had happened. And every time someone told the story, it ended exactly the same way. With laughter. Because while my mother-in-law had spent 6 months searching for a scandal, all she really discovered was the truth. A human woman loved her alien husband. An alien husband loved his human wife. Their child was born into a family built on trust. And the biggest mystery in town wasn't the pregnancy. It was how anyone could spend so much money being so spectacularly wrong.